Hello, this is Gonzalo Lira speaking to you live, and this is the Roundtable, episode number 25. I am joined by the estimable George Galloway. George, how are you, my friend?
By the grace of God, all good. Thank you very much.
George, I'm a huge fan of George. He has been so kind to me on so many opportunities. I'll get into it during the broadcast, but it's lovely to have him on. And I'm also joined by Alex Thomson of UK Column. How's it going, Alex?
Hello from the Netherlands, Gonzalo. It's pretty busy, but pleasant weather here. And as usual, we're just trying to digest everything that's being thrown at us from the news before we present the UK column viewers with our seasoned judgment on what's going on. A difficult act, really, but we try to maintain it.
Yes, it's very difficult. Alex, it's a pleasure to have you on. We're also joined by Syrian Girl, who's famous from Twitter. Syrian Girl, how's it going? Thank you for joining the show.
It's great to be here. It's going well. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you on. We're going to start the show because, as all of you know, in chat, you all know about the Nord Stream bombings, how the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines were bombed. And Vladimir Putin gave a response, which I think is very interesting. And I'm going to play that video. Chat, I hope it plays properly. And if it does, do me a favor and hit +1 in the chat to make sure that it does. Here goes. Let me see here.
I speak for you, knowing that my message will always be twisted or framed, which will result that you all will think that I am the main perpetrator. But the only thing that I've done is protecting my fellow countrymen, people who feel Russian. I'm not interested in overpowering any other nations or disrupting of various worldwide markets, or be any kind of frustration in any kind of process. I'm only interested, as I have been saying since the beginning, in protecting my fellow countrymen who has been under attack for at least 10 years. I am not against the citizens of Europe. It's your leaders who are against the citizens of Europe. I know that you have been indoctrinated for generations with propaganda, but this is your wake-up call. The Nazis won the Second World War. Your leaders are the Nazis, and you are well aware of that. It's the same club with the same approach towards other slave states, with ignoring being a particular aspect of that, ignoring your or mine opinion. Why would I blow up my own gas pipes? I can simply shut them down. All these kinds of accusations against Russia are very easy to debunk. Like, who is bombing the nuclear factory at this moment? Europe is being led by the Satan-worshipping Nazi leadership. Wake up, people. Let me be the actor in my own slave state. You have enough bullshit of your own to consider. Everything is a scam. They are lying to you.
Well, that was pretty heavy insofar as the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Some people are saying that this is a fake translation. I don't know for a fact. As I understand it, it is true. Alex, go ahead.
Yes. Unfortunately, it is a fake, and there's no shame in being had here. It happens to all of us, and I include myself with my old GCHQ expertise. But it's a Dutchman. I live among the Dutch, and as usual, the guy went over the top in his subtitling and voiceover, using words like bullshit. And this time, because I'd seen the Dutch voiceover and subtitling before, I screwed my eyes shut and listened to the underlying text voice, and it's Polish.
So, okay.
Yeah,
I'm so sorry.
I actually have an informal rule of, I call it Thomson's rule with my own channel on Telegram, Eastern Approaches. When people ping me saying, is this true or fake? Because there's so much confusing stuff. I say Thomson's law is, if it's Putin, it's probably fake unless proven to the contrary. And if it's anyone else, it's probably an accurate translation shorn of context.
Okay, I'm an idiot. I should have run this by you first.
No, this happens all the time, Gonzalo. We all get had this way. And you know the fact that it's a fake that's widely circulated is newsworthy in itself.
Okay, I'm so sorry, chat. Truly, I am truly embarrassed, and I'm so sorry to have misled you, because I was genuinely thought that it was accurate. I thought that the language was a bit over the top, but I thought that it was a genuine response. Please, to my guests, George, Alex, Syrian Girl, please accept my apologies, and to chat as you as well. That was clearly my mistake. and I should have vetted it first.
No, it's
The
a good
Syrian girl.
opportunity to debunk. It's a good opportunity to debunk it on air. So you actually did a very good thing.
No. Well, it was. I never should have aired it without having vetted it first. But it seemed, sometimes there in journalism there's a notion that it's too good to check because it's such a juicy thing, and it was my mistake, and I should have checked it, and it won't happen again. Chat, you have my word on that. Anyway, I wanted to bring it to you, Syrian girl, irrespective of the fakeness of this video. What do you think of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 bombings, and what's your appreciation of it, and what did you think when it happened?
Well, the first thing I thought was I remembered back in February when Biden was. I remember there's a video of him saying that he's gonna shut down Nord Stream 2, come rain or shine. I think he used the words "no matter what" or in any way. Probably I paraphrasing, but yeah, I brought that video back, and it's going viral. And I became aware again of Victoria Noland, who also made similar comments about Nord Stream 2 around that time, saying that if Putin were to invade Ukraine, that the US is going to find a way to stop Nord Stream 2 from ever happening. And I think that these statements are quite damning. They show motive. And that we remember Victoria Noland was also the person that said, excuse my French, but F the EU.
Yes.
I don't know if we're allowed to swear on air, but we said bullshit before.
No, my videos are demonetized, so you can say whatever you want. It's perfectly fine.
So obviously they don't care what's going to happen to Europe. I think at the end of the day, they themselves even post the destruction of Nord Stream 2. If you listen to the statements from the State Department, they're basically saying, let's look at the bright side of this. The bright side is that Putin is not going to be able to use gas as leverage against Europe. And why don't you guys buy an electric car? I mean, that is exactly what they've said. And I think that that's, it's pretty obvious. Also, of course, we have Poland and Norway opening their own pipeline conveniently on the same day that Nord Stream was destroyed. So I think I'll say those words, and I'll open with that for everyone else.
Yeah, George, what do you think of the whole of this whole boondoggle?
It's an October surprise, just a couple of days early, intended to influence the midterm elections in November in Joe Biden's favor. I noticed that Donald Trump offered to basically bring the war to a negotiated end, although Joe Biden's people would have him killed on the way to the airport if he tried it. It's very clear to me from the moment that it happened. I'm so old, Gonzalo. I recall the United States being convicted in the International Court in The Hague for the crime of international terrorism when they illegally blockaded the Nicaraguan port of Corinto in 1982. And this is the equivalent, though more serious, in that it could begin a process that leads to wide-scale pan-European war with, of course, in the ultimate bad case, an exchange of nuclear weapons, battlefield even intermediate. So it's much more serious, but it is a crime of international terrorism. And as Syrian Girl just said, the US had the motive, they had the means. Just 20 miles from the scene of the crime, the USS Kearsarge, complete with helicopter escort in a NATO sea, the Baltic, they boast is a NATO sea, was just 20 miles away. And it would be no difficulty at all to dispatch a pod or two, or even frogmen without a pod, to place the 100 kilograms of TNT, which is what the estimate is, that would have been required to break both pipelines at that particular juncture. Remember, these are fortified such as they can withstand the anchor of an aircraft carrier dropping on top of them. And so there's no way of damaging them except by a powerful explosion. And, you know, you don't need to be Einstein to work out that there's only one beneficiary of this crime, and it certainly ain't Russia.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Also, what I understand is that that particular U.S. naval warship had been doing exercises for the past 3 months. It wasn't like a recent thing. They'd been from June, I believe, been carrying out exercises of various sorts. And yeah, so it seems to me quite obvious that the Americans decided to remove Russian leverage by committing an act of terrorism that is really against the European people. I mean, Alex, is there any other way to look at this?
Not really, Gonzalo, because you know the classic whodunit trio of questions is means, motive, and opportunity. And the US is the only actor which has clearly all three. We discussed that on yesterday's UK Column News. So for those watching on repeat, it's Wednesday, the 28th of September, ukcolumn.org. And you're very right to finger these exercises because something I shared on my channel is that, in fact, the taxpayer-funded Norddeutsches Rundfunk, so the equivalent of the BBC for the part of Germany, including the Baltic coast, reported in its Schleswig-Holstein rubric at the beginning of August that there were thousands of US soldiers on 3 ships in the Western Baltic, a total of 4,000 of them, including helicopter pilots, marine infantry, doctors, strategists. Nothing exceptional in that in and of itself. But then it reports that on Wednesday morning at 6 a.m., so this is the very beginning of August, or maybe in the late days of July, as you say, they passed the Danish island of Bornholm, and then the Americans turned their AIS, that's the ship identification system, off. Of course, you do that in some exercises, but it's a further element indicating that something untoward may have been going on. But the big extra node of this that I'd like to bring out is the complicity of the Poles is likely in the matter because they are very close. And, you know, sort of European history 101, wherever in the world you grow up, is there are 2 powers, Russia and Germany, and the Anglo-American and later Franco-British interest is to keep those 2 from getting the act together. And the pawn in the way is Poland. People tend to stop there in most history curriculums in most countries. But the further element of it, I'm afraid, is that there is this great division between, frankly, a chauvinist attitude of the Polish government, which took on genocidal proportions between the 2 world wars, and the people who, as in other parts of the world, simply wish to get on with their lives and reach some kind of modus vivendi with both Germany and Poland. But the Polish elite, as best exemplified by the member of the European Parliament, Radosław Sikorski, Radek Sikorski for short, in his tweet, their attitude has been, and it has been for literally 100 years, that they have a role in that zone of countries, the belt of countries between Germany and Russia, which is to anti-Russianize the entire lot of them, to be a vanguard country, sacrificing itself and its people for the interests of what was called in its heyday a Promethean policy. Prometheus, as in shaking your fist at the giants and the gods and eventually ensuring their downfall at your own cost. So this is, I'm afraid, well-known stuff, and it does look as though there's quite a serious possibility that the Poles were the local partners, although the heavy lifting for this will have been American. I don't believe that even a serious European military power like Poland has got the technology to punch through 4 inches of concrete encasing 4 inches of steel at a depth of a couple of 100 feet on the seabed. I don't think that that's really something that anyone other than America and Russia can do.
There's talk that the Danes and the Swedes participated peripherally, but if they participated, then they were in the know about this particular operation. So it wasn't like a lone wolf kind of thing. It was basically NATO on NATO. First of all, have you heard anything about the Danes and the Swedes, if that report is accurate? Because I do believe that his first name, I think it's Michael Helmer, has been positing that, and he seems to be a fairly accurate individual.
Yes,
that
gentleman has come to my notice before because he was the courtroom reporter and eventually became a book about the Litvinenko case. And he was the first, certainly writing from a British perspective, to cast major doubts on the Litvinenko story, which was happening right on the next desk to me at British intelligence. And I had some very serious question marks at the time. as to how many people in British intelligence were setting the narrative that it must have been the Russians who did it from a very early stage. So Helmer I take seriously. And yes, the Scandinavians have been, even the Swedes, traditionally a Baltic and Russophobic or rapprochement with Russia type of strategic country. Certainly the Danes and the Norwegians are Atlanticist countries like the Netherlands, where I'm speaking from. And it's become painfully apparent, even to the conservatives in those countries, that there's nothing their governments will not do to prostrate themselves to the City of London and Washington and Wall Street. That I'm afraid is standard fare now in those countries. So the Scandinavians form part of, this is very much something from George's day as well, you know, the dialogue of New Europe and Old Europe from 20 years ago, which he magnificently drew into question the way it was being framed. That's really the attitude here, because Germany alone in the Baltic, the Western Baltic, has been labeled here clearly by American strategists, and perhaps the Brits in the background, as usual. They take care of the mind control and the soft power, of course, the presentation and framing. The Americans will have labeled Germany as Old Europe, whereas the Scandinavians and the Poles, because the two belts that matter in Northern Europe and the Eastern European fringe down between Germany and Russia, those countries are in the know. They're trusted, and they don't have the pride or the depth that Germany, France, and Italy would have. So basically, they will not say no to an unlawful, illegal, and outrageous U.S. operation.
So, Siri girl, what do you think that this is going to? How do you think the repercussions are going to be in Europe? Because it's too obvious to ignore that the Americans, even ignoring the aid of the Poles and other nations, what do you think are the repercussions going to be in Germany and Europe generally?
Well, the problem is that what can Germany do? I mean, I think that they're going to pretend to go along with believing that Russia did it or something along those lines, or they might just say, oh, we have no idea. I just don't think that they're in any position to stand up to the United States. After all, they're still technically an occupied country. So even if they want to do something at this point, like, they have no one else to rely on, because I think as far as I understand, the biggest source of gas right now in Europe is Norway, if I understand correctly. So basically, they know that they've been had, but they're so, they have the boot over their head to the point where I don't see how they can actually say, hey, you know, what have you done? Like, there's going to be repercussions to this. They might be under the table, but publicly, I don't think so. And I just wanted to point out as well that, you know, even though the recording you showed us at the beginning was fake, I think there was a good point made there, which was, I mean, they haven't really given a motive for Putin to do this. They haven't even attempted to claim some kind of obvious motive, because of course they could just shut down the gas out of valve. It's his leverage. It cost $10 billion, $11 billion project, just Nord Stream 2, not Nord Stream 1. And it's I hear it's not even fixable, and it took a decade to build. So it's completely nonsensical and ridiculous that they would throw that accusation. And it's just going to be a litmus test for not really even the intelligence, but who's outright lying at this point.
Do you think that anybody seriously takes it that the Russians did it, or do you think that only the propagandists believe it?
I would really be fearful for the world if someone actually really believed that, because I think, like, the average IQ would go down quite a bit if that were the case.
Because George, how do you see this particular thing? Because personally, I have never been so scared in my life, because this is really upping the ante, and this kind of escalation, which I had never anticipated. It hit me like a bolt from the blue when I heard it a couple of mornings ago. And now I think to myself, you know, the Russians are perfectly within their rights, because after all, it was Russian property that was destroyed. And what do you think the reaction will be of the Russians? I have my own ideas, but I'm very curious to hear your ideas as to how the Russians will react to this, and where do we move forward in this conflict?
Only someone wearing a straitjacket and locked up, one hopes, in Ward 5 of Broadmoor Hospital, the hospital for the criminally insane in England, would believe that the Russians blew up their own $10 billion pipeline when they could have just switched it off. And I'm told that there was between 600 million and 800 million euros of actual gas lost, bubbling in the sea, the bubbles that Sikorsky thanked the United States for in
I couldn't believe that.
A tweet later deleted.
By the way, he deleted it, yeah.
Yeah, so no one in their right mind could possibly believe that Russia did this. And I don't think, given my reference to an October surprise, that they are intended to. They are supposed to think, good old Joe, how sly, how cunning. He's dealt a major blow for American power, and he hasn't even been, caught. It's going to be ambivalent, probably for a while. And I have to thank Alex, whose erudition is quite extraordinary, for reminding me of the Schleswig-Holstein question, two words that I have not heard since I was a schoolboy. It was wonderful to hear them come from Alex's eloquent lips. But the dichotomy that Alex drew is precisely the dichotomy. It's not that Germany is not also a satrapy. It is, as Syrian girl pointed out, there are limits to what Germany can do. But Germany is not a weak country. It is highly populous. It is economically very strong. And it has, Europe knows this, the world knows this, a sense of itself in a way that these smaller principalities and satrapies do not and cannot. They cling to the American empire in a way that Germany is somehow embarrassed about doing so and would prefer not to have to publicly display their devotion to Washington. And of course, little soldier Schultz is not Angela Merkel, but there might be another Angela Merkel along in a minute. If I were in German politics, I would now strike out on, if you'll forgive me, a German nationalist basis, that Germany has been humiliated, its economy is being beggared in the service of the United States. And vote for me, support me, I will make Germany great again. I think that that would be a winning card, because I feel sure that the German people, least of all the people in the world, know that this crime was committed by Joe Biden and the United States. And I understand it may not be accurate, that the CIA informed them a few months ago in the German language. I've seen it but can't read it, because of course British people can't speak languages. We just speak louder. I read the translation and it very clearly stated that the US might well attack these pipelines. So I'm sure that even in the Broadmoor equivalent in Germany, in a straitjacket, they know that it was Joe Biden that did this. And so this dichotomy may be sharpened by these events. Perhaps Germany will begin to stand up for itself. If it doesn't, then they will have destroyed their own economy and what survives of their own national self-respect.
Yeah, because I'm hearing, and Alex, I want to bring you in to correct me if I'm wrong here, but I am hearing that the Germans are actually saying that there are going to be not only rolling blackouts, but even the mobile telephony is not going to be working 100% because of this lack of energy supplies. I mean, that's just outrageous. You're
That's
watching.
serious.
Germany, which has always been the standard bearer for high technology, a society whose infrastructure is second to none. I happened to live in Germany about 10 years ago in Flensburg, right by Schleswig-Holstein, which, as a matter of fact, my maternal grandmother's family is from Schleswig-Holstein. And it was paradise, and now they're not going to have even mobile telephony, and they're going to have rolling blackouts, and older people are going to freeze to death. Is that basically what's in store for Germany?
Yes, and we see a lot of this traffic come by. We translate and present some of it on UK Column, and George is spot on as always. The problem with US hegemony or banking hegemony, much of it comes from the City of London originally, over Germany, is that Germany has so much depth. George sketched much of it. Other aspects of it are that Germany is really a country that hardly has a capital, because it has a dozen cities which each have the economic and cultural depth that most European countries have only in their capital city. It has 16 federal states. There have been deep and abiding problems in reuniting East and West Germany, but East Germany has come out of that maelstrom actually presenting the best realistic patriotic ideas from both the real left and the real right, actually. Particularly with regard to Russia engagement. So people abroad may think that the strand of German thinking that George has sketched is only on the fairly far right, Alternative für Deutschland, because they're the people who get the quotable quotes in foreign media and social media in particular. But if you look at East Germany, the party known as Die Linke, I know it's the continuation party of the SED, the regime party of East Germany, but it is by no means entirely a DDR-minded party. It has figures in it like Sarah Wagenknecht, who led the party for a while, who has given many speeches in the Bundestag speaking about the need to reach a rapprochement with Russia from an old left perspective. Her amicably divorced ex-husband, Ralph Niemeyer, has recently come back from the Russian Far East, speaking to very top-level Russian figures on effectively, but with more credibility than in the case of Juan Guaido, presenting himself as the German leader in exile. And he's a credible man. I've dealt with him one-to-one. He was the man who triggered the fall of the Berlin Wall with a well-placed question on that fateful night in 1989. He's no dreamer. And Niemeyer has been telling people on his own channels that he is within a hair's breadth of Kremlin recognition as the government in exile.
The government in exile of Germany?
Of Germany, and getting gas deals, even if only for symbolic value, signed with Russia. Right? This is all going on. Germany has got such depth to it. You wouldn't believe it. I mean, people are aware of the officious side of German nature, which, as usual, nations' best critics are usually within their own ranks. Concerned people who are prepared to tell hard truths to their own people. The Germans have enough people who criticize this knee-jerk in them. But, it's said quite bluntly sometimes, but well, that the good Germans are extremely good, right? They outweigh the stereotypical bad Germans on pretty much every scale. And, whatever issue we are talking about today, of course, it's acts of state sabotage and terrorism. Another day, it may be economic turmoil. Another, it might be access to healthcare that doesn't kill you. In all of these, the Germans quietly, in their pockets, geographical and social pockets, which are very diverse around the country, have already said, let's go on without this government. They've already done so in an admirably quiet and efficient manner.
But are you talking about the
Germany is going to
the cosmopolitan leadership class?
Yes, absolutely.
From the outside, it looks like there's this cosmopolitan leadership class in Germany and the other nations of Europe that they seem to march in lockstep with the American leadership class,
yes,
irrespective of the damage it does to their own countries. And
well, the trouble is, in the Mediterranean countries, the Italian name for such people is bonisti, do-gooders. They tend to keep coming back in cabinets and coalitions. Germany, however, because it's so federalized and there's a real rising danger of secession, de jure or certainly de facto secession of people in places like Bavaria and Saxony, that they'll have as little to do with Berlin as possible. Because of that, these overlords have to tread much more lightly. Yeah? And the amount of irony, mockery, and cold-blooded hatred, despising there is of the ruling class is quite something to behold. And as soon as you cross the German border from any of the neighbouring countries, you start realising, this is a country where the authorities are at undeclared war with the people. You don't get that feeling in other countries, that the government has already lost the people, the federal government certainly.
Syrian girl, I want to bring you in a little bit because we're talking about Europe so much. And you're in Australia, as I understand, correct? And
Yes, I am.
What's going on in Australia? Because it seems as if the global American empire is positioning Australia to be its shield in some sort of conflict with China. And they're fighting over the Solomon Islands, of all places. What's your sense of the people in Australia versus the leadership class? Because again, the leadership class in Australia and New Zealand seems to be part of this cosmopolitan, transnational leadership class that is unresponsive and disinterested, quite frankly, in the common people.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have something as positive to report as Alex said on Germany. At least in the city that I'm in, which is in the West Coast, and in a lot of cities, people are ready to believe what the media tells them to. There is some dissidents, but it's a small percentage of people. And when it comes to relations with China, it's usually been the Labour Party that has had better relations with China than the Liberal Party. However, both parties are now basically antagonistic towards China. The last prime minister that was positive towards China, Kevin Rudd, was taken out of power through a coup. And the intelligence agencies are targeting Chinese citizens inside Australia, and they're getting all of the focus against China as well. And the politicians, they're following suit. There was a parliamentarian which was he's of Lebanese descent, happens to be also, which was targeted because they thought that someone in his cabinet had influence with the Chinese government, and they showed no evidence towards that end. His name is Shauqati. So they're really like on the war footing against China now, and as far as they're concerned, their security, they're part of Five Eyes. Their security is really linked to the United States, and they don't want to step out of line in terms of that, even though economically relations with China would benefit Australia much, much more.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. That's the thing, that all these countries seem to be shooting themselves economically in the foot or through the lung, as Viktor Orban very well put it, and they don't care about the people. I mean, George, how the hell did this happen? How the hell did we wind up with a leadership class?
Bill Clinton famously said it's the economy is stupid, but it turns out that that's not true. That it is possible for a political class to commit economic suicide for their own people, and yet, so far at least, stay in power. You would have thought, according to the laws of aerodynamics, the bumblebee cannot fly. You would have thought that a political class that set out to destroy, self-harm their own people's economic essentials would be doomed, but so far not. Who knows? The Italian government has fallen, whilst Giorgia Meloni may very well have very bad views on some things, like relations with China, like support for Ukraine and the war and so on. Real life might intrude on her administration and push the Italian government in a certain direction. We discussed Germany, the real march of economic events, which may well bring political change. The Bulgarian government has fallen. The Czech government may fall. Tens of thousands on the streets of the Czech Republic again yesterday for the second time in the month of September. Macron lost his majority. Boris Johnson lost his seat. Joe Biden will lose the midterm elections. I'm pretty sure of that.
I'm not so sure. I think that they'll be able to cheat their way to a victory, but please continue.
Oh, well, that's also possible. No, that's also possible. But the law of diminishing returns eventually intrudes on cheating. The more you cheat, the less people believe the outcome, and before long, you've got a real problem on your hands. As Kennedy said, those who make peaceful change impossible make violent change unavoidable and inevitable. And I think that that's true. So I suppose the point I'm making, so far, politicians have self-lacerated their own people's vitals and gotten away with it. But you can't be sure, Gonzalo, that that will obtain forever.
Well, yeah, I mean, my thinking, the view of it, and I want to get to Syrian Girl to talk about the Syrian conflict and the parallels with the Ukraine conflict. But before I get to that, I want to ask Alex the following, or make the following comment. It seems to me that the leadership classes in the West, this cosmopolitan class, they seem hell-bent for leather on causing a wide-scale conflict, a global war, a truly global war. I remember reading about 10 years ago or so, 11 years ago, I was running a financial blog, and I was outraged by Paul Krugman's columns, basically calling for a war with Iran, because he kept insisting that it was the war that raised the American economy out of the Depression. And clearly in the United States, we are in a depression. We've been in a slow grinding depression since the 2008 global financial crisis. And so my thinking, and I want to hear your opinion about this, my thinking is that the cosmopolitan global leadership class of the West believes that the game is up, that the constant indebtedness cannot be sustained. We are reaching a Minsky moment insofar as over-indebtedness is concerned. And therefore, a good old-fashioned global war, like World War II, would raise all boats, especially the American boats, especially the boats of the American leadership class. And it seems that they are deliberately trying to provoke this global conflagration. Would you think that this is a reasonable inference from what we have seen so far? Is this the reasonable trajectory of this particular situation?
Well, Gonzalo, it doesn't even have to be an inference. If we start at the Russian border and work westwards, the Baltic Three, Poland as discussed, down at the other end, the Caucasus nations, Georgia in particular, have intermittently for a century, because much of the geopolitics of those regions is very similar to the breakup of those empires at the end of the First World War and the brief independence of those countries, they have intermittently said to the West, more specifically to the Anglo-American alliance in the last century, it is your job to give us the weapons we need to start really an Armageddon-style conflagration with Russia. And the Estonians, for example, have said up to prime minister level that in such a third world war, we would be wiped out. But the unspoken other part is, but hey, the West or our noble idea would carry on, right? And as we've already been teasing out, as you go westward, certainly through the northern half of Europe, across the North European plain, where most of the economy happens, there has been this pretense for a while, which is now dissipated, that there's a social contract the closer you get to France, where the idea was enunciated, the idea that the leaders will provide stability and a bit of peace, and in return you will put your keep your nose clean, get your head down and get on with making money and not being too political, right? That was the unspoken agreement, but that is dissipating. You're quite right. I know you might get mocked for it, but you're quite right to say that Europe's governing class is cosmopolitan. That is, it has a commitment to no place with capital N and capital P. Continental philosophy, and in its train also English-speaking philosophy, has gone that way for a long time now. You've seen in Latin America some of the sharp-end results of that. Idealistic visionaries who, in every continent now have either gone Maoist or whatever it may be, and thought that it was necessary to throw a few million of their own people under the bus in order to achieve the utopia or to save them from their own problems. We're dealing with a religion, really, that wishes to refound humanity, to remake human nature. And the insidious thing about it is that it has now manifested in Europe, Western European countries, which on paper are still nominally Christian, nominally conservative governed. These labels are useless. We've got the social revolutionary factor in government. At UK Column, we never tire of saying that the Conservative Party, which in the normal run of things governs Britain because of the demographics and the electoral boundaries, the Conservative Party is now rife with people up to parliamentary level who say that we wish to introduce creative chaos in order to remake society. The Conservatives are actually often to be found on the left in this case. So don't actually think that because a country has a certain reputation like Britain or the Netherlands of being stoic and averse to extremism in who it elects, that it will not actually foster a third world war. The game really is up. I saw the earlier stages of this in my time in British intelligence. There was already this inchoate, this unspoken sense that if it doesn't work in this current decade of efforts, then we're going to have to hit a reset button in the sense of go for all out against Russia. So that really is there.
Jesus Christ. Syrian Girl, for those of you who don't know, Syrian Girl has a fantastic Twitter account, and I followed her because of it. And she, of course, is following the Syrian conflict with like a giant magnifying glass. And she had the smartest takes on the Ukrainian conflict. And I want to ask you about that, because the Russians have been in Syria since 2015. And what has been the experience of the Syrian government with the Russians there? And how has the development been between the Assad government and the Russian forces that they called in?
Well, I think that it's very important to look at the Ukrainian conflict outside of just Ukraine and more so link it to the global war. Essentially, this war has been going on since 9/11, even before that maybe, but especially it sparked off post 9/11. You had Afghanistan, Iraq, then of course Somalia, Libya, and then Syria, and it's been nonstop, nation after nation being destroyed by essentially sometimes not under the name of NATO, but NATO countries being involved. And Ukraine was one of the countries that was involved in the occupation of Iraq as well. I think that at some point, Syria is also part of Russia's sphere of influence. They have the port in Tartus, they have access to the Mediterranean Sea, and the location of Syria is not so far from Russia's borders either. So I think that targeting Syria was also part of and parcel of the plan to isolate Russia, and Ukraine was the step after that. So in terms of our experience with Russia, a lot of people right now, they're like, oh, in the Western media, they say, oh, Russia destroyed Syria. This is ridiculous because the war, I can show you images of towns and streets from Syria before the war began, before 2011, and just a couple of years later, 2013, and those areas were completely destroyed. And before even the Russians came in, the U.S. occupation started in 2014. The U.S. was bombing Syria in 2014, but of course nobody mentions that. I mean, the Russians there, they helped to defeat ISIS and Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda is still holed up there in Idlib. And the United States is occupying the northeast of the country. They're currently stealing Syria's oil actively, and they've been, there's videos on my timeline on Twitter if you guys want to see that. And they're preventing, more so, just not stealing it for themselves, they're preventing Syrians from being able to access that, as well as their wheat. So Syria has experienced this energy crisis for the last 6 years. Same thing, every winter we don't have enough heating, old people are dying, and nobody seems to pay attention. But now, this thing is spreading. It's not just going to be in Syria anymore. It's not just in the Middle East. It's getting to Europe. And you did say, Alex, you mentioned that there might be protests in Germany. The thing is, there was actually protests in Germany a day before the pipeline blew up, demanding that they stop the sanctions on the pipeline and launch it again. But now, of course, that's impossible. So what's left for there to be protesting about? They're gonna they're going to have to go and escalate to overthrowing the government, as we hope that they'll be able to, because this thing is going to keep going. I think that the fact is that it's looking like, even before this Ukraine war began, even before 2014, starting from Syria, it's looking like it's heading towards World War III. And this escalation, I think, in Sun Tzu's Art of War, it says, build a golden bridge for your enemy to cross. And perhaps like negotiating and opening Nord Stream, that was the golden bridge that could de-escalate the situation. However, there's also a Sun Tzu quote that says, burn the bridge behind you to show the enemy that you have no love for going back home. And I think by bombing Nord Stream, that's essentially what the United States is telling Russia.
Well, by the way, Syrian girl, can you tell us more or less the state of play in Syria at this time? Because I am not as up to date on the Syrian conflict as I ought to be. But from what I understand, the Assad government is firmly in power, and in at least the unoccupied area of Syria. And they are essentially beating back these terrorist organizations that are funded and supported by the Americans. Do you think that there will be an opportunity at some point in the near-term future whereby they can push these terrorist groups and the Americans out of Syria altogether?
It's a very tricky situation. You have Israel occupying the Golan Heights, obviously, Israel bombing regularly. You have Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood, other Muslim Brotherhood aligned militias aligned with Turkey that are occupying Idlib province. Of course, NATO, Turkey is a part of NATO. It's a very powerful part of NATO. And then you have the Americans occupying the entire northeast of the country, alongside the Kurdish SDF groups. Now, the thing is that what is the solution to this? Right now, Syria and Russia are sitting on the table to negotiate with Turkey to have them pull out. At the same time, Turkey is not happy with what the United States is doing in the Kurdish.
Why not?
Because they're trying to create a autonomous Kurdish region in Syria, which is going to threaten Turkey's security. But the Americans are going to have a lot of trouble doing that, because the Kurds are not a majority in the areas they're trying to annex. They're only a plurality. So there's other minorities there, Arabs, Assyrians, Turkmens. It's going to be very, very difficult for them to achieve. However, they are allowing for there to be a safe zone for militants to come across the border and create trouble. So for Turkey, it's interesting also. Turkey tried to, well, in fact, it's still blocking Finland's NATO bid over this Kurdish, which NATO actually and the US acknowledges a terrorist group, the PKK. That's what they've labeled it as. So Turkey is trying to get something out of this chaos as well in Europe. So it's an interesting Mexican standoff, very complex. But essentially, I think Syria and Damascus are just waiting for the Turks and the Americans to cancel each other out.
Oh man, George, to bring it back to you, it's like, I'm here in Kharkov, and sometimes you start hearing things, and I have to mute myself or go to a different location to have better sound. Anyway, George, how can I put it? It seems as if the Americans, they always do the exact same thing. They support the most extreme people in the nation that they target, and they create just absolute chaos. Where does this wellspring come from? Because the Americans, after the Second World War, they created the Marshall Plan. I mean, the whole idea was to raise up the level of everybody so that there wouldn't be conflict. But there seems to have been some sort of inflection point in the not too distant past, where all of a sudden the Americans are all about chaos, as Syrian Girl aptly calls it. Just create more and more chaos everywhere they go. When do you think that this happened, and why do you think it happened?
Well, with all respect, I don't think that was the intention of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan's purpose was to stop the advance of communism to block the advance of the Soviet Union ideologically, to, as it were, fertilize the ground that, if left arid, might have been eventually overrun by the USSR. But you don't have to go far into history. In the 1950s, the British in particular, but with American agreement, were forgive me, I have no idea what that noise was. The British were building up the Muslim Brotherhood that Syrian girl just talked about. Now, on the face of it, the British Raj had little in common with the emerging Muslim Brotherhood, but the point was, my enemy's enemy is my friend, and President Nasser was their enemy. The Arab nationalist idea that might have united the Arabs from the Atlantic to the Gulf was a far greater threat than any two-bit here today, gone tomorrow, bearded obscurantist cleric in the Muslim Brotherhood would be. So we actually, I once put to David Cameron, Prime Minister's questions in 2014, I asked him if he had read Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley from my own home city. Had he read Frankenstein? And if so, had he read it to the end? Because if you read it to the end, you discover that whilst you can create a monster, once you've created it, it's no longer in your control. That's why it's called a monster. And we have been involved in building up this Islamist monster that is still murdering people in Syria. And if it had gotten its way, if not for Russia and for the Syrian Arab army, its black flag would have been flying in Damascus, and we would have been responsible for that. And of course, we are doing it now with the Nazi currents in Ukraine, which are by no means peripheral to Ukrainian politics. They are central to Ukrainian politics. So we're ready to support Nazis. We're ready to support Hydra-headed Islamist fanatics. We're ready to support anyone who is against the man or the force or the country that we have identified as being our enemy. And in that sense, I don't think anything has changed, Gonzalo. Some of the personnel have changed, some of the words, the verbiage surrounding it has changed, but the methodology of my enemy's enemy is my friend remains constant through post-Second World War history.
And yeah, I mean, I completely understand it. And I wonder, and I'd ask you, George, do you think that this is the inevitable path of great empires? That ultimately this is what they do inevitably? The Roman Empire, the various empires throughout history, that they basically cause chaos in all the peripheral areas that they're interested in?
I do, and it's why I don't share, if Alex will forgive me, an apocalyptic vision of what's going to happen next. I appreciate that the way things are, you could easily infer that this is all going to end in a big mushroom cloud, but I don't myself believe that. I think a point is reached where an empire is sufficiently enfeebled that paying that price is not acceptable to enough people, and people in strategically important areas of the state, that they would not permit it. To give an absurdist example, if Joe Biden in his senility were to literally reach for the bag, the golf ball, the football rather, where the nuclear buttons are, someone would stop him from pressing them. He would not be able to bring about the end of the world. If necessary, the generals would take power and stop it. So I don't myself believe, although there's trouble ahead, no doubt, and that trouble will be turbulent and extreme, I don't believe it's all going to end in World War III.
Well, I hope you're right. I mean, I really do.
So do I.
Yes, because like you, I have small children and I want them to have a bright future. And so, yeah, one of the things to be more precise about the current situation, something that I've noticed and that I believe for some time, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, was instrumental in the negotiation of the prisoner swap and the prisoner swap between Russia and Ukraine. And I'm sure that there were a whole bunch of codicils to that swap that we're not aware of. But Alex, I want to ask you, my thinking has been that the next likely target of the American regime change would be Saudi Arabia, because it looks that MBS is not playing ball. He's getting way too friendly with the Chinese and the Russians. And he is very clearly, number one, it's very obvious from their interactions. If you see video of the two interacting, that Mohammed bin Salman and Vladimir Putin get along famously. I mean, it's very obvious that they get along very well. And that, of course, it leads to a level of trust between not just the two leaders, but their entire, the apparatus of regime that all great leaders have. And the fact that MBS was instrumental in this prisoner swap and the other adjacent things that we are not privy to at this time. Do you think that the Americans might be getting nervous about MBS? And I know for a fact that Joe Biden hates MBS, and that might be the next place, odd as it may sound, this long.
It looks like we've lost Gonzalo for a moment.
Seems so. Perhaps he'll return to us.
As he's the host, I think we'd better hang on a moment. I do hope that everything's all right.
Yeah,
oh, you're
fine.
there.
Yeah. If I ever go off, don't think that it's anything nefarious. It's usually just a burp in the internet service or something like that. And if I drop off for any reason, just keep on going. I should have mentioned this before the broadcast, but I'll tell you now. So please.
That's quite all right. I got the question anyway, Gonzalo, and yes, I do agree with you. MBS, if people know the Victorian humorous opera duo Gilbert and Sullivan and their opera The Mikado, MBS is now the Lord High Everything Else. You know, he's the heir apparent, he's prime minister, he's chairman of the Council of Defense and Security and everything, right? And of course, the undeclared title is Lord of Oil, right? Yeah. So this is really not a million miles away from what Syrian Girl and George were discussing in previous notes of this conversation, because the very big picture with empire is that the financial centers of the English-speaking world, and then also when political Zionism rose from about that time onwards and culminating in the Oded Yinon plan in 1980, very much had the idea that there are not allowed to be self-sufficient nations, particularly in the belt of countries between Germany and Russia going down to the Muslim world, where all the action and the wealth and the strategic location is. No, then you must have fiefdoms, right? So, I mean, we didn't have time to touch upon the Balkans in the 1990s, or my own specialist area, the Caucasus, where the most hideous war is now going on between Azerbaijan and Armenia, where Turkey's little brother is Azerbaijan is sending troops to torture, rape, and murder, as always happens with Azerbaijan, I'm afraid, and with quite a lot of foreign jihadis imported, a lot of testimony of that from 2020. All of this is part of the same angle as what to do with the Ottoman Empire, because like the Austrian and the Tsarist Empire, when that fell apart at the end of the First World War, this was the great opportunity to strike. And the City of London and Wall Street were very put out, very piqued to see that a number of zones in this area, Egypt was mentioned by George and is a very fine example. Another is Yugoslavia. Another is Syria. Many of these countries decided on a positive model of, they would have called it state socialism. I know some people do not like that language, but if you're coming straight out of foreign overlordship, feudalism, into independence, and you have one dominant resource, often oil, then the best thing to do, obviously, is to nationalize it, right? So that's to the chagrin of the money power in the world. And no, I'm not meaning that as code for Jews before anyone has a go at me. But to the chagrin of of such people, these countries formed such arrangements. And due to the way the Islamic world went, and in the Cold War, Eastern Europe, that arrangement was effectively fossilized for a long time. Now all bets are off. And people can see why, in the case of the evolution of Europe since the end of the Cold War, that the blocs are no longer the same. It's less evident in the case of Saudi Arabia. But the big loss there, of course, is that the dollar is now based on the petrol reserves, the fuel reserves, and has been since 1973-74. Viewers, I'm sure, will know about the central role of Henry Kissinger in bringing that about, as testified by Sheikh Yamani. MBS is the man to watch, because he has made the reason why he's not returning Biden's calls, it would seem, is he's worked out that the dollar is a busted flush. One of my favorite interviewees, Sheikh Imran Hussein, one of the very top commentators from the entire Muslim world, to my mind, has made this economically astute observation that there is a kind of triangle between Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia now. Although Sheikh Imran, like many good Islamic clerics, will say no end of sharp things about Saudi Arabia, such as that it needs to return to the garbage can of history. You know, he's astute and unbiased enough to say that is where that's the kingmaker state, really. Just as Saudi Arabia and Qatar have a role as a sink or a swing state for oil and gas production, they hold things back to make sure that the world economy and political scene isn't imbalanced. So likewise with the economy, you know, that if Saudi Arabia even openly courts a ruble or yuan system, really that's curtains for everything up to the current US way of life. You know, it's very many bets are off. So you know, this is a continuation of what we've seen in Ukraine and Syria and the Balkans in the generation before that. And in fact, to give a little codicil to that, the one war zone I've mentioned where there wasn't any such infrastructure and any determined transnational positive socialist model was the Caucasus. There wasn't any noteworthy reserves. So when the West got its hand on Georgia and Azerbaijan in the 90s, the first thing that the City of London and the US decided to do was to make sure that there was, and I now realize I didn't at the time, it was an economically unviable and unnecessary pipeline put in place from Azerbaijan via Georgia to the Turkish Mediterranean coast, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. And I remember typing all kinds of documents when I was an intelligence officer, because I was told to do this, saying we need to keep intelligence resources in the Caucasus because the BTC pipeline's there. This was a self-fulfilling prophecy, or a self-licking ice cream cone, wasn't it? And to punish the Armenians, who at that stage were still very happily aligned with Russia, less so because of the lack of support in this current war. But the Armenian territory was avoided in a kind of dogleg, very expensive in laying these underground pipelines. But the message was quite clear. You know, we'll make sure there's infrastructure of note there, and then that will be a casus belli. If we don't like the look of you, we'll knock you out. And as you've said, Gonzalo, the Americans in particular go for the bluntest tool in the box often. I remember a whole British intelligence delegation at the Cabinet Office confronting the CIA in a gentlemanly fashion about this under the Saakashvili regime in Georgia, and saying, why are you so cozy with this thug of an interior minister, Mr. Merabashvili, and all the bandits he's brought into the police? And they looked a bit embarrassed, but then they said, well, look, hey, we find that we can talk to him just fine. The other guys talk too much detail. But this thug that Saakashvili has made king of his interior policy, we can do business with him. At least we know where the trouble's going to come from.
Jesus Christ. The corruption is just off the charts. I mean, I suppose what happens to me is that, see, I grew up in the United States, in Southern California during the early 1970s, and I was given all the notion that the United States are the good guys, and we have these liberal values, and we want to bring these liberal values to all the little brown people so that they can all live in happiness and material well-being and prosperity and all the rest of it. And it's quite the opposite. Syria girl, I want to ask you to turn it to my neck of the woods right now, which is Ukraine. Okay, from what I understand, and anybody's free to correct me if I'm incorrect, because after the embarrassment at the beginning of the show, please correct me if I'm ever wrong again. It seems that tomorrow there's going to be an extraordinary session where de facto the republics in the regions rather in Ukraine that were in the referendum are going to be annexed, and the formality of it will take place early next week, but de facto it will be as of tomorrow. How do you think the war is going to change? Because I know that you've been following this war really, really closely. What do you think will happen now?
Well, I think that this is essentially Russia is taking this step in the hopes that these regions will be treated in the same way that Crimea is treated, which is that it is going to be treated as part of Russia.
Right.
If you notice, no, there's not the Crimea is not one of the regions that are being bombed right now, even though it's being claimed by Ukraine as part of Ukraine.
Yeah.
So the hope from the Russian side is that the threat of escalation of bombing or invading what will now be Russian territory will not be enough for Ukraine to come to the negotiating table and for there to be a ceasefire. I think, unfortunately, all indications from every talking head and this pipeline that just burst seems to be that that's not going to happen, that the Ukrainians are going to continue what they've been doing, disregarding the referendum. So the annexation. So that is going to escalate the situation. But I think that the Russian mobilization are going to send a lot of troops on the ground, and it's going to make it very difficult for the Ukrainians to be able to take any more territories.
Yeah, because they talk about the mobilization as if they're going to pump 300,000 troops into Ukraine, green troops, but they don't seem to realize that this mobilization will mean that these 300,000 men that are brought back into the armed forces of Russia will be distributed throughout Russia, and it will be those soldiers with more experience who will be in, like, I don't know, Vladivostok or Ekaterinburg or wherever. They're the ones who are going to be moved into the Russian front. So they're not going to be green troops. They're going to be, many of them battle hardened already in Ukraine, because there's been an active recirculation of the troops in the Ukrainian conflict throughout the Russian armed forces to get them, to be vulgar about it, to give them a little bit of taste for blood so that they know what to deal with real combat. So do you think that because of this now, the Russians are really going to escalate in terms of number of troops in the conflict zone, and that they're going to declare outright war with Ukraine?
I mean, they're already in outright war with.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah,
but,
but
in terms of, I think Putin's speech when he said he's not bluffing, I think that's really important. I think Russia doesn't have any choice but to keep going. It can't back down. Unlike the US, it's an existential situation for Russia. Like, its very existence is on the line. So I think certainly there's going to be an escalation. Those troops are going to be sent in. I think, if you recall, during the Iraq War, there was a troop surge of 300,000 soldiers, and that actually did change the situation on the ground. At the time, there was as a result of that, interestingly, there were less American deaths every day. I remember I was watching the number of deaths every single day, and after the surge, there was less deaths. So I think that it works. So I think also, don't forget, the Russians have Iranian suicide drones that have changed the situation on the ground also. And they're very cheap, and they're going to be buying a lot more, and we're going to see many more videos of the Iranian drones in action. So I think it would be in Ukraine's interest to negotiate. I just
you dropped out there. George, you had something to comment.
Yeah, I mean, tomorrow is Red Letter Day, no doubt about it. Russia has lost 250,000 pro-Western liberal Russians who are at the Georgian border or headed for, Belgrade or wherever. But they've gained 8 million people who actually want to be Russians. And by anybody's calculation, that is a net gain. It's a very important day and a very important development. And I was going to make the point that the Honourable Lady made, that this should be compared with the surge in Iraq, which did indeed work. And I think that this surge will also work. But none of us know, at least I assume none of us know, what the Russian game plan actually is. Have they done all of this for these parts of the Donbass that most people in the West couldn't pronounce or spell or even point to in the map? Or are they intent on having a neutral government in Kiev? It seems to me that if you take all of the land up to the river Dnieper and leave Zelensky plus the fascists plus NATO in what would then become a kind of rump Western Ukrainian state, rather like Kosovo, dependent on the European taxpayer, dependent on NATO personnel and armament and so on, all you've really done is move the problem a little bit further away, which in terms of flight times of rockets and missiles and so on is not actually all that far away at all. It's slower for infantry, but not that much slower for a rocket, for a missile. So again, I don't know, but if I was advising in the Kremlin, a job I've wanted all my life, it would be that actually the war will have to continue until there is a change of regime in Kiev. Either a military government there or some kind of political change that leaves in power in Kiev people who will not hand over their remaining territory to NATO to build a terrifyingly dangerous nuclear base there.
No.
But as I'm not such an advisor and as I don't know their mind, I have to assume that the war will continue.
I would endorse that, and I think the Russian mind is split on this right up to, it would seem, Kremlin level. I'm not claiming any particular inside information, but there are quite a lot of indications that Russian generals, as indeed Ukrainian generals have been in this war, have been quite vocal, sometimes vitriolic, in resisting the presidential apparatus in the war designs. But there seems to be a mirrored situation. Both sets of generals in this war in the respective capitals, if not on the front line, do seem to have this attitude that if the president pushes this war aim much further, he's betraying the nation. Because the political command sees that much more clearly than the military command, which of course is wanting to conserve its men and conserve its ammunition to live to fight another month. The political command is much more taken with this question of, if I give up this vector in the war or give up the war entirely, will the nation survive, let alone this presidency? Military men seem to be a bit more hard-nosed about these things and just say, for goodness sake, man, get some kind of a ceasefire while the going's good. So the cracks in these societies, George quite rightly alluded to the ones in Russia, but the same is true in all of the countries in that part of the world. They're not going to heal overnight. Winning hearts and minds from, shall we say, the most admirable part of the Russian effort, the diplomatic and some of the state building that we've seen from the military, not least in Syria, that seems to be the constituency that wishes to thrust forward with Russia having an honourable role in the region and the world. But it does seem to be, at this stage, not having been able to win hearts and minds in Ukraine or the neighbouring countries. They are stuck in this time warp of trust us, we know the Russians, even though, as we quite rightly said now, Russia is in an existential trap. Now, the attitude from the Ukrainians, all the other countries around, certainly from the intelligentsia, seems to be, we won't concede an inch to the Russians, we'd rather be dead than red. All this old rhetoric has come up again. And I just put that on the table. I don't want to make a smug point with it. But, there's going to be, not least in Western Ukraine, I think that's the epicenter of it, there is going to be this residual pool, however this war is finished, of nutters to deal with. And in the parts of Ukraine towards Lviv, they are a significant proportion of the population.
Yes, they
so
are.
if you cut Ukraine at the right bank of the Dnieper, or if you take 80% of it and leave the Ukrainians with just the Carpathians plus a bit of Rivne, you've got the same outcome, which is that the Poles, as the immediate American client state there, and one with their own hegemonic designs locally, they have got the big headache. What do we do with the nutters? This has happened at the tail end of other conflicts where the West has, particularly the Anglo-Americans, have stuck their oar in. The nutters hang around from generation onto generation.
Yeah, because my thinking has been from the very beginning of this conflict that the Russians intend to take everything basically to the west of the Dnieper and all of the south of Ukraine up to Transnistria, including, of course, Odessa, and create a rump Ukrainian state stretching from Kiev to just shy of Lviv, and have that rump Ukrainian state be a friendly nation. Whatever form of government, they don't really care. Somebody basically like Lukashenko, somebody who is docile to them, basically, and push all the nutters to Western Ukraine. And I've actually thought, I said so at the time, this was back in April, that the Russians would want to cede Western Ukraine to the Poles with all the crazies and have that Western sliver of Ukraine be Poland's Vietnam.
Well, Gonzalo, if you look at this from within Poland and within Ukraine as well, you will see the more honest people say that, you know how this came about at the Yalta conference, where Churchill got his 2 cigar matches and showed Uncle Joe, look, we can punish Germany without causing Poland a net gain or a net loss. Let's slide the 2 matches across the map.
Yeah.
And the Poles have never really, I mean, for one thing, even de jure, the part of East Prussia that they split with the Russians on along a straight line, the northern part became Kaliningrad Oblast, the southern part became a part of Polish territory. That was never constitutionally absorbed into Poland in the way that the rest of it was, even not in the way that Silesia in the west was. And now there is a fault line, as in many other countries, between a liberal, as in progressive, Baltic coast and western half, and a more Catholic conservative south and east. This is a way of saying for short that there's nothing to stop the Polish ascendancy saying, well, we'll just shove the country back where it was, because of this sense of destiny they have, that our role is to civilize these backwards Eastern Orthodox people and the Belarusians and Ukrainians. They got up to a lot of havoc between the wars by pursuing this policy and making themselves a kind of imperium in miniature, in the intermarium. Right. So, and from within Ukraine as well, Gonzalo, you probably won't have had the chance to see this for yourself, given the part of Ukraine you're in. But just before this war started, I was doing a lot of traveling in central and southern Ukraine, and within the moderately nationalist Ukrainian-speaking 2/3 of the country, the north and the west, there is this very sharp fault line, linguistic, religious, some would say ethnic, destiny-focused fault line between the belt just west of the Dnieper, the right bank, and the hillier Polish-facing far west. And these, when they're being frank, especially with foreign visitors like me, they will say, well, frankly, we don't regard the other half of that ethnic Ukrainian nation as the same people as us.
Yeah, that's why they're so cavalier about shelling civilians in the Donbass, because they don't view them as Ukrainian. They don't even view them as people, quite frankly. I mean, I've been to Western Ukraine. I crossed the whole country on a motorcycle once. And so I am very aware of this ethnic split that is... Personally, living here, I find it very difficult to distinguish between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians, if not impossible. But they know. I mean, I guess it's Freud's, the narcissism of small differences.
Well, it's like, Scotland's been long plagued with sectarianism, and George will testify. People become rather too well trained in spotting tiny physiognomic differences or differences in accent and vocabulary. This is going on within the ethnic Ukrainian portion of Ukraine. Right, Kiev area people will take one look or listen to one sentence of someone from the far west and write them off as a hick, and vice versa. This stuff ends up with, even before the war, this ended up in fisticuffs. Before it, we speak about any of the non-Ukrainian Russian-speaking ethnicities from the east and south, the Jews, the Russians, and very many others who came as industrial imported workers. Just within the Ukrainian-speaking nation, there's this undercurrent simmering, and as with so many countries in the region, the question is that they haven't hammered out is, who are we? They haven't got a modern national identity, and they're the poorer for it, and they're that much more vulnerable to exploitation because of it.
No, I mean, like, I look at all of this, and as a Chilean, and having grown up, spent so much time in the United States, I tend to view people as people, whatsoever their differences of skin color or slight differences of physiognomy. I just take them as they come. I suppose that makes me a child of the West in that regard. And these kinds of minor differences, I think of them as inconsequential, but to the people themselves, they're essential. And Syrian girl, I want to bring it to you. These sorts of differences occur in Syria, not just between the ethnic groups, but also within Syria, I assume. Or is the Syrian nation unified because of this crisis?
I mean, I would like to actually add to the comments on Ukraine with Alex and George, because one of my closest friends is a Ukrainian who is half ethnically Russian, half ethnically Ukrainian. And even long before the war, like 15 years before the war, she told me that her mother was basically excommunicated from her family because she married a Russian. And if I asked her where do you come from, well, she says, well, I was born in the Soviet Union, which at that time, we were all kind of the same thing. And now, like, the situation is completely different. So she helped me to understand that there is this difference between Ukrainians and Russian. Interestingly, if you go to Syria, we think of them interchangeably, like Ukrainians are Russian. What's the difference?
Yeah.
So it does make me a little bit sad in a way that by having these breakaway regions join Russia, they're sort of solidifying antagonistic feelings between Russia and Ukraine for a much longer period of time. This war, of course, added to that. In Syria, we had a saying like, of course, there was blood spilt, but blood spilt between family, like eventually it's going to be water under the bridge. I heard people say that. Like eventually everyone's just going to forget. These things are not going to last forever. That's why I wonder for Ukraine and Russia how long they're going to have an enemy on their border who are Slavs as well. Putin said that we have a familial feeling towards Ukraine, and I think unfortunately NATO has basically destroyed that. And I want to point out something that George says about the nuclear bases. The U.S. actually pulled out of the INF Treaty in 2019, which is the intermediate nuclear treaty, the intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, which means that they're going to have nuclear bombs being able to be launched from, definitely Ukraine would be in range towards Russia at a speed in which Russia can't shoot them down, basically. And last month they pulled out of New START. So all of these things are pushing Russia into the corner. As for Syria, ethnically speaking, I can go on forever about that.
Give us the short version.
Essentially, we're all Syrian. Of course, I think that the only group that really has that feels they're not necessarily Syrian or not part of Syria would be some of the Kurdish group. Not every Kurdish person doesn't identify as Syrian, but certainly if an individual has recently arrived into Syria's borders from Turkey, from Iraq, that happens to be from a Kurdish background, a lot of the time they wouldn't identify as Syrian, even if they have lived in Syria for 10 to 20 years. But everybody else, I think, whether we be Armenian background or Caucasian, Christian, Muslim, Assyrian, we're Syrian. So I've never felt anyone say differently.
No, because I'm all of these ethnic differences. I understand it, and I regret it because I think that it keeps people from just living on with their lives. But I think it's an inevitability. We've been going on for almost an hour and a half, so I want to wind it down. And I want to ask George, I want to ask each of you, but I'm going to start with George. This conflict in Ukraine, a lot of people are saying that it's going to be a forever war. Some people that I respect very much and whose opinion I value tend to believe that this is going to be a perennial conflict. But now with the changes that we have seen, the escalation of the Americans insofar as blowing up Nord Stream, the surge, and I mean the annexation of these territories by Russia, and the surge of troops, and the potential for a greater escalation diplomatically and certainly militarily. With all of this, do you think that it's just going to keep on grinding on, or do you think that all of a sudden we're going to have a break and everything will settle one way or the other? Either it'll settle down peacefully, or there will be a gross escalation into a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. George, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, on the question of recognizing people of a different stripe, a mixed marriage in Scotland is one between a Christian Protestant and a Christian Catholic. And my own parents were exactly that. And growing up as someone of Irish Catholic background, I was convinced for many years that Scottish Protestants had square heads, and that's how we could recognize them. I later realized that was only partly true. But the forever war, I don't subscribe to. If you look at Yugoslavia, for example, the depth and bitterness of the Yugoslav war had to be experienced to be believed 20 years ago. And yet now, for example, there are a very significant number of Serbian people living and working in Croatia because the economy is better, the tourism industry is better, the wages are higher, and so on. And when someone who actually does that told me this, I actually found it difficult to believe. I would have thought that a Berlin Wall of consciousness would separate the Serbian and Croatian people forever, but it isn't so. So I don't believe that the Russian-Ukrainian war will be a forever war, but that requires a different kind of political power in Kiev. If we were to get in power by military coup or by an epiphany electorally amongst Western Ukrainian people, however it happened, if we had a government in Kiev that was genuinely determined to be neutral, no NATO forces, no NATO training, above all, no NATO weapons, it is perfectly possible that Russia could have good relations with a Western Ukrainian entity. And I realize, of course, that pigs are flying past my window, and that if my auntie had a beard, she'd be my uncle, and all of the caveats that we normally put. But it isn't inevitable, is all that I'm saying. Whether it's likely is, of course, a different matter. That's why I feel sure that this war still has quite a bit of distance still to run. I don't believe it will finish with this red letter day in the Kremlin tomorrow.
Oh, no, I certainly don't. I'm just wondering if there will, once this really comes into play in a big way, whether there will be a sudden break where either full escalation or just the defeat of the Zelensky regime and just a simmering down in a negotiated settlement of some sort.
I agree with what you said earlier, and I too have been saying this for some months, that the whole of the south of Ukraine will be, as the Russians would put it, liberated. I think it will link up with Transnistria, where several 100,000 Russian people live in some peril on both sides, from the Moldovan side and from the Ukrainian side. And I think that's what the final shape will look like. So there'll be an entity which can be described as eastern and southern Ukraine, and there will be an entity that can be described as Western Ukraine. And the closest comparator I can come up with is that Western Ukrainian regime would quite likely develop in the way that the so-called Kosovo is. Basically a non-entity without endless subvention of money and material from the EU and from NATO. Another anvil for the European public to carry around on their back as if they didn't have enough.
Yes, yeah, that would certainly be the case. Alex, what do you think is what do you think the future will bring us?
Well, George has given a lot of food for thought there, and just picking up on the last point, Germany itself for 100 years has had its own imperialism, modeled on or shadowing that which they regarded as the glorious Big Brother example of the English Weltherrschaft class, right? And part of that, as enunciated by Friedrich Naumann, the father of German liberalism in 1915, was this concept of Mitteleuropa. And that went right through to the use of the Croats under Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the eternal foreign secretary they had, who was of the same liberal party, stoking conflict. And that was deliberately in order to funnel not just the raw materials, but more particularly the more vigorous working age people into Germany for Germany's industrial powerhouse. So even if by some miracle Anglo-American meddling, or even if you want to be a little more even-handed about it, Russian meddling to the extent that it arguably exists could be turned off, and Ukraine could live in some kind of economic political vacuum or with a firewall around it, you would not have peace. You would have the societal upheavals continue, and you would have the Germans and Poles in particular still vying to be the cultural hegemons and deep state of note for the Ukrainians. But I am heartened by what George says about the slow and kicking death of Scottish sectarianism, which is happening, because the other half of that sectarian divide, of course, the other end of it is Northern Ireland. And I think the big lesson there is, since the hot phase of the Troubles ended about a generation ago now, the biggest surprise, reflected right up to census level and certainly informally in society, is that when you ask the young adults now, are you British or Irish, Protestant or Catholic, they will often reply, I am Northern Irish, right? And that can be replicated. I mean, take that stubborn break in the Russian, otherwise contiguous support for Russia along the Black Sea coast, namely Odessa and its hinterland, where I traveled quite a lot just before the war, right? And the thing is that the original population, both Jewish and Ukrainian, emigrated with the dissipation of the Soviet Union. People of all kinds of surprising nationalities, like Romanians and Gagauz, who were Turks, came to live in Odessa. Obviously, their common language was Russian, but the identity which has developed has been, we want nothing to do with the nutters from Western Ukraine currently running the show in Kiev, rather anti-American, anti-imperialist, but at the same time suspicious of the Russians. And, if there's one holdout which prevents that sort of Novorossiya joining up with Transnistria, it will be this sense that the local people there have decided to reject all forms of foreign meddling, even if they know that they will be the poorer for it economically. Right? And I think this can be replicated in other areas. So, yes, of course, parce the possibility of some spectacular escalation, or indeed of a palace coup in either Kiev or Moscow, which are real possibilities, I think, at this stage.
I have to ask, you think that there's a possibility of a palace coup in Moscow?
Yes, as always with the Kremlin, you just do not know what's going on, but you listen carefully to the hints. And I mean, the man is going to be 70 next month. I think he's not going to go on forever. Yeah, he's got contemporaries and sort of mini-me's like Sergei Shoigu, who could take over. But you cannot ignore now that, whatever word I use is not ideal, but shall we say the intellectuals or the middle class in Russia really would like a change. Not just the anti-patriots who fled because they'd rather have access to Western IT and money. I saw enough of those in the Caucasus earlier this summer, right? That Russia can say, bid farewell to them, no loss incurred. But there is a sense, I think, that, maybe privately, even the likes of Lavrov, the foreign minister, are saying, and I used to listen to Lavrov Putin phone calls in my old job. He would do it, in a gentlemanly fashion. But I think he's saying, we need some kind of modus vivendi with the neighbors. And here, at the moment, if you're a thinking Russian patriot, particularly, as I say, a general, you're going to be thinking, are we going to be bleeding our best young men and maybe soon even young women, as in Ukraine, they look a bit likely to conscript women soon, endlessly? That's another way in which an otherwise intractable conflict can grind to a halt instead of shuddering to a halt, is if somebody or a cadre of people of sufficient clout and courage pull the plug on the operation. So it is a real possibility. Of course, it would be fraught with Western meddling. I mean, the same dynamics are observable in Iran. I don't want to get sidetracked at the end of the conversation, but that there is genuine discontent with the regime there. It is overwhelming. And at the same time, it is also true that the BBC and the whole pyramid of Western soft power, with Britain in the lead, is sticking a finger in the pie, wanting to exploit and steer that situation. Both of these things are true simultaneously.
Okay. And a Syrian girl, I want to ask you. We began with you and we'll end with you. How do you see the future playing out in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia?
Well, since George and Alex gave an optimistic view, I'm going to go for the pessimistic view. I feel the long wars, if anything, the past is to go by. We've had a 20-year war in Afghanistan. It was like a frozen conflict that, wasn't even really frozen. It was continuously hot, but at a low temperature. Libya is ongoing. Syria is ongoing. It's frozen now as well. The front lines haven't moved. Ukraine, I believe it's going to end up frozen. But I think the regions where there are frozen conflicts, they're just going to keep expanding. I think this NATO drive to push Russia and corner it and isolate it is going to continue. And I think that there's an elephant in the room that none of us have really, really discussed, which is Israel and what Israel wants. And Israel's involvement in Ukraine, in the fact that the U.S. invaded Syria and Iraq in the first place, was under, it's something that Israel wanted.
The clean break.
Sorry?
The clean break memo that basically outlines.
Alex also did point out the Yunon plan, and I'm sure George, he's always talking about it too. So I believe there is a faction of people that are hell-bent on the apocalypse. I know it sounds crazy, but there's a faction of people who are just crazy, and they are following a messianic prophecy. Even ISIS was following this messianic prophecy, and they're just going to take us. They're going to drag us all down. Maybe cooler heads will win, but so far I've seen no evidence of that.
Yeah, I unfortunately very much agree with your point that there is a bizarre messianic cult. But unfortunately, on that down note, I'm going to call an end to this stream, which has been a delight. I want to thank all three of you. Thank you so much for joining me on this broadcast. Please stick around after I end the show, because I just want to say a few personal words. And chat, once again, I want to please forgive me, chat, and my esteemed guests for having played at the beginning that fake video. It was my mistake, and it was, you have no idea how embarrassed I am, because I felt like a fool. Because I thought, oh, this is really cool. This would be a great jumping off point. And it's a fake. Oh, God. And so I'm so sorry about that. And chat, I tell you now that I'll never let that happen again. It was my mistake. And I'm so sorry. And please, to my esteemed guests, please accept my apologies. George Galloway, Alex Thomson, Syrian girl, thank you so much. And chat, I hope you enjoyed the show, because I most certainly did. And I will catch you next time. Take it easy.
Thank you.